It's to punish the people that didn't buy the book. Good evening. My name is Rabbi Jeffrey Saks of Atid and Web Yeshiva. Welcome to the third of our 5 sessions on Midrash Agnon, live from Agnon's home. I know that a number of you here in the studio audience just enjoyed a tour of the house with Nikki, and you'll be glad that you did, because the story that we'll be reading tonight takes place right here. And well, I hope that in 2 weeks' time, on our last session, we'll have an online tour for the folks at home, because we couldn't really do both at the same time. It would have been too crowded. To those of you online, welcome. Just a quick technical note: as you can probably see, the WebEx underwent some big system-wide change. It's a little confusing. If you're having any trouble. Contact our tech support. But everybody on the screen can see you. There's Bakol, who didn't want to brave the wintry. Wave to us, Bakol. And there's Ben and Barbara. Everybody's here in Israel. There's Alan in Chicago. Wave to us, Alan in Chicago. Alan Goldenberg in Chicago. There's Esther in Harnof. All the team is online. And then lots of people that didn't bother to get a webcam. Our program. So thank you to all of you that are here with us. Just as everybody's settling down, thank you to all of you that are here with us for braving the weather. We have a little bit of a smaller crowd tonight, but for those of you that are listening to us from abroad, we're enjoying a very, very wet, rainy, thundery Jerusalem day. And those of you abroad don't understand how happy that makes us. And just one last brief announcement before we begin. Of course, our sessions are brought to you by our friends at the Toby Press. Visit them at tobypress.com and find Jewish bookstores everywhere. Buy their fine literature, which includes wonderful translations into English of Agnon's writings, as well as other fine literature, Hebrew literature and translation, other original English literature, but including our volume, A Book That Was Lost, 35 Stories by Chush HaRei'ach. The joke is told almost like on the Borscht Belt. You remember the Borscht Belt? Right, yeah. How do you keep a fish from smelling? No. How do you keep a fish from smelling? Cut off its nose. Now the joke works. The joke works because in English, to smell can be a transitive verb or an intransitive verb. It can mean you stink. When we say you smell, we can mean you stink. You really need to take a shower, use some soap. Or it can mean you smell, meaning you are able to imbibe the odors of the smelly person who's standing there. You have a sense of smell. And that is the grammatical point, the axis around which our story tonight turns. Now you would think a story about a grammatical point would not be interesting to anybody but the fellow there in the third row, my good friend David Kerwin, who's an amateur grammarian and writes a very interesting blog called Balashon, BALASHON.com. And anybody that's interested in these questions is as Alan put that up in the chat, Balashon, which is an English language blog about interesting things in Hebrew language and Hebrew grammar. So that's why we got him out of the house tonight. This story, The Sense of Smell, written in 1937, let's get right into it. The excellence of the holy tongue. The excellence of the holy tongue. Hebrew, Ivrit, is called Lashon HaKodesh. That's a nickname. The holy tongue, the holy language, is a nickname already from the time of the Mishnah that we use to describe Hebrew. And it represents something that we think about Hebrew. So Agnon begins, the excellence of the holy tongue. The holy tongue, Lashon HaKodesh, the language like no other. All other languages exist only by agreement, by heskem. Each nation having agreed upon its language. We all agree that this is a book. Why? Because we agree that it's a book. But if we were to all agree that this is a shnook, well, if we got that message out, everybody would understand. That's what it means that a language is heskemi. It's by agreement. There are reasons for the etymology of words. There's a reason that this is in English called a book. We borrow it from the German word Buch, and why that is, we can, the grammarians could try to figure out. But language is heskemi. Like we all agree that this is this, and that is that, and that's how language works. But the holy tongue is the one in which the Torah was given, the one through which the Holy One, blessed be He, created His world. Angels and seraphim and holy beings praise Him in the holy tongue. Now, it happens that this is a machloket. This is a difference of opinion, and not by coincidence we're learning this story tonight, because yesterday we read Parshat Ki Tisa. The very beginning of Parshat Ki Tisa, the Torah talks about the shekel hakodesh, the holy shekel that everybody had to give into the Beit Agnon. We'll read it again in a couple of weeks on Parshat Shkalim before Purim, and the Ramban Nachmanides says, trying to explain what the word kadosh means, shekel hakodesh. What can it mean that a shekel is holy? We have some shkalim in our pockets. We don't tend to think of him as being too holy. So what does it mean holy? So the Ramban, on a partial side point, describes why Hebrew is Lashon HaKodesh. The Ramban, Nachmanides, who was something of a mystic, describes how God looked into the Torah, of course, being written in Hebrew, and created the world. It is the language with which the universe was created. It's an inherently special and holy language. Maimonides, the Rambam, disagrees and says that Hebrew is a holy language because, does anybody know? What? No, that's what the Ramban says. The Rambam, everybody can look it up. It's in our parsha. It's Shmot Perek Lamed Pasuk Yud Gimel 30:13. You can look up the Ramban, and the Ramban quotes the Rambam. The Rambam says that Hebrew is holy because it doesn't have any dirty words. Any curse words that we have today in modern Hebrew, we had to borrow them from Arabic and from Yiddish and from all types of other languages. But in and of itself, the language in its pristine state has no dirty words. So the Rambam, Maimonides, disagrees and says Hebrew is holy because of how we use it. But in theory, according to the Rambam, according to Maimonides, we might be able to desacralize it. We might be able to do damage to it. According to the Ramban, the position that apparently Agnon is citing, and we'll have to see as we go along, is he citing that unabashedly? Is he saying this here and maybe meaning something else as we go along? Keep that question open. Agnon says Hebrew is holy because it is inherently holy. And therefore, for this reason, I'm going to skip ahead. Like last week's story, which was even shorter, we obviously can't read the whole thing together. For this reason, all Israel should take care with their language, keeping it clear, precise, especially clear and precise, especially in these last generations so close to redemption. 1937, he's writing this. 1937. So close to redemption, so that our righteous Messiah, Mashiach Tzidkenu, may he be revealed speedily in our own days. We'll understand our language and we will understand his. Mashiach is coming, right? The redemption is nigh, and he's going to come. What language is the Messiah going to speak? Hebrew, obviously. So we're going to want to talk to him, and he's going to want to talk to us. So therefore, it's very important that we treat Hebrew very, very carefully. Chapter 2. Each of these little they're hardly chapters. Each of these little subsections in the story have these kind of long, elaborate, almost grandiose titles. It's a way of kind of puffing up what's going on here. Against the scholars of our generation who write in every language except the Holy Tongue. But someone might object and say, is it possible to speak a language that has not been spoken for more than 1,000 years? Hold on a second. There you go. Barbara, is the page correct now? So you have a control down at the bottom left-hand corner that says view. You should be able to rotate the image. They're seeing the image. Okay. Hopefully Ezra will be able to help you. Someone might object. It's just by coincidence our tech supports guy named is Ezra. So it shows you that Hebrew is a special language. Someone might object and say, is it possible to speak a language that has not been spoken for more than 1,000 years, as some stupid folk among the Jews have said? Now this is actually what happened in the beginning of the 20th century. In the continuation of the evening, hopefully we have time, we're going to get back to it. You remember Eliezer ben Yehuda. There he is. There he is. There's good old Eliezer ben Yehuda. Who was he? Wrong. He was not the founder of modern Hebrew, because there is no modern Hebrew, says Agnon. There are different stages of Hebrew. Now, Agnon and his good friend Bialik, did you talk about Bialik on the tour? No, Bialik and Agnon, they were good friends. They disagreed about a lot of things. There's Bialik. Chaim Nachman Bialik. They're good friends. Emunah Yaron, Agnon's daughter, who grew up in this house, in her memoir describes, a lot of important people would come here to see her father. Rav Kook would come here. There's the whole story, maybe you heard about how they didn't sit on that chair over there. And other important people would come to visit Agnon. And occasionally the ambassador from Sweden would show up and hand out a Nobel Prize. Bialik would come. So Emunah said that when they were little kids, the only person that was interesting was Bialik. Because all these important people would come, they'd want to speak to her father. Bialik would come, he'd want to speak to the kids. And he always had candies in his pocket, which is kind of like the nice Bialik, to counter other things we know about Bialik. So Bialik and Ben Yehuda, they didn't agree about a lot of things, about the mechanism by which Hebrew should be not revived, because Agnon is arguing Hebrew was, this idea that Hebrew was dead and it was revived, Tchiyat HaMetim, is not true. It was at best, at most, it was in the deep freeze, and we defrosted it. But Agnon says, whoever says that Hebrew can't work, that we can't make a go of it, whoever says that hasn't paid attention to the important facts. Even though speech passed from the lips, it never passed out of writing, and it is there for anyone who seeks it. How is this? The Torah, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Siddur. Hebrew was always part of Jewish life. Hebrew was always part of Jewish life, even though we didn't use it when we went to the butcher. And we didn't use it when we went to the bakery. And we didn't use it when we went to the makolet. We didn't call it a makolet. We had to call it something else. How do you say makolet in Yiddish? There you go. But this question of could we make Hebrew work, this was hotly debated in the beginning of the 20th century. When the Technion was founded, in 1912, there was a raging, it wasn't even a debate, it was a feud over, and then a few years later in 1918 when the Hebrew University was founded, could you have a university, could you have a college of sciences that would work only in Hebrew? Well, we don't have the vocabulary to sustain it. And the side that said, no, we can make it, we can give it a go, ultimately prevailed. But there were people that thought it's not possible. We'll have to have these, we'll have an institution, we'll have a Hebrew university, we'll have a university here. That's why they call it the Hebrew University. It was to show the people that thought you couldn't do it, we're going to have a university. Why didn't they call it the Jewish University? Of all the names to name it, it's a funny name. Right? Why is it called the Hebrew? Because it's a university, and it's on its identity card, on its Teudat Zehut, is the fact that it operates in Ivrit, that it operates in Hebrew, and that all of the study, the sciences and the humanities and the study of law and the study of medicine, it's all conducted in Hebrew. And that, parenthetically I should add, is one of the great accomplishments, one of the great cultural accomplishments, one of the great historical accomplishments of the Jewish people. Not just that we came back, but that we did it, that we made it work in Hebrew, that we made it work in Hebrew. Agnon has a line in this volume called, there's a volume called Me'atzmi El Atzmi, From Myself to Myself. It's a collection of, it was published after he died. It's a collection of occasional writings. It's not fiction. It's letters. It's occasional writings. It's transcripts of speeches and other such things. And there's a line here where he said, "Mash ira latalis l'tefillin, ira l'shavrit." What happened to the talis and tefillin? That's what happens historically to Hebrew. In the times of the Mishnah, people wore talis and tefillin all day long. The talit was the clothing. That was your jacket. That's what you put on when you went out of the house. And because we were on a more exalted plane, men at least, wore tefillin all day long. Now, because since tefillin requires a very high level of kavanah and concentration and intent, we don't do it because we're not on that level. So we only wear tefillin when we daven in the morning, and even then, sometimes we can't manage the right kind of intent. But once upon a time, in the days of Chazal, in the days of the sages, in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, they used to wear talis and tefillin all day long. So once we went into the exile, talis and tefillin, Agnon says, got relegated to the Beit Knesset. And the same thing happened with Hebrew. And now we have to pull it out, not to remove it from the Beit Knesset, but we have to expand it out of the Beit Knesset. Then why, says Agnon, why do certain scholars make such a mess of their language? Because they put worldly matters first and words of Torah second. If they would make Torah their basis, the Torah would come to their aid. And that, of course, is foreshadowing. If you've read the story, you know that's precisely what's going to happen in this story. But it also is a statement for Agnon, what he thinks the source of the Hebrew revival is or ought to be. And for Agnon, and in truth for Bialik, Agnon, you've seen Agnon. He had that big velvet kippah on his head. Perhaps you've seen a 50-shekel bill. Bialik, where is the picture? Right? See, Bialik, he doesn't have a kippah on his head. Agnon, he had that big velvet yarmulke, right? And they didn't see eye to eye on everything. But on this, they saw eye to eye, and in this, they were opponents of Ben Yehuda. And they thought that the raw material from which we would draw to revive Hebrew, to expand Hebrew, to make Hebrew come alive and workable in the modern era, had to be first and foremost from our traditional sources. And there are all types of interesting debate. There's certain words that Ben Yehuda won, and there's certain words that Bialik won, and there's certain words that other people came up with. If we have a chance, at the end, we'll talk about more specific examples. But Bialik had this like a kind of triage of if we need to invent a word like aeroplane. Well, we didn't have a word for airplane because there were no airplanes. So if we need to come up with a word for airplane, where should we look? So he had this kind of sense of like a radar that we could scan and figure out what would be the first place we would look to find a word that we could borrow or modify for a modern term. And for Bialik, we always started first with the Torah, and then we worked outward. If we have time at the end, we'll look at a specific example. Chapter 3, the secret of writing stories. I mean, it's almost a sin to learn this story in English because it's about Hebrew. So let me just, I'm going to read a few sentences in Hebrew. And if you understand Hebrew, you'll hear how terrible my accent is. And if you don't understand Hebrew, you'll hear how beautiful it is. I remember when I was a little kid, it must have been about, 5 or 6. I was in a museum of natural history in New York with my mother. And we were in the elevator. Remember those big elevators in the museum? and there were people standing next to us in the elevator speaking French, which I knew that they weren't speaking English, but I didn't know what language they were speaking. And I remember my mother saying, well, listen, they're speaking French. Pretty sure I didn't even know where France was. And she said to me, listen how beautiful it is. And I remember that left an impression on me, on a small boy, that language could be beautiful. And so here in chapter 3, Agnon writes, I'm sorry you don't have it on the screen. I don't think you have it in front of you either, unless you brought Hebrew. Right? If you can, you should read the stories in Hebrew. מאהבת לשוננו ומחיבת הקודש, אני משחיר פניי על דברי תורה, ומריב עצמי על דברי חכמים, ומשמרם בבטני, כדי שיקונו יחדיו על שפתי. For love of our language and affection for the holy, I darken my countenance, mashchir panai. It's an expression, a rabbinic expression. It means like I'm concentrating, I'm focused, I'm gonna, we say like, in English we might say like I'm gonna dirty my hands with something, right? Like you're gonna dirty your hands with something important, and like the side result of like working on it is you might get a little dirty. So mashchir panai, I'm gonna darken my face, I'm gonna blacken my face because I'm gonna be focused on it with constant study of Torah and starve myself over the words of our sages. These I store up in my belly so that together they will be present to my lips. Like Agnon describes Talmud Torah both as a normative mitzvah that we study Torah, and he did. Agnon as a child, I think I mentioned this in our first session, Agnon as a child, for a couple of years he went to Cheder. He was considered an Ilui, a genius. The teacher says to his father, I have nothing left to teach him. It's actually very similar to stories by Rabbi Soloveitchik. Probably this happens in every little town. And from that point on, he learned with his father, and actually he spent most of the day in the big Beit Midrash in Buchach, where he a huge library, and he just read everything. He just read everything. There's a story that when he got to Berlin, in the tour you were mentioning that he came on Aliyah. He was here for about six and a half years, and then he goes back to Berlin. It was meant to be a short trip, and ended up being a little longer. But he's a young man. He's in his 20s, mid-20s, late 20s, and he goes to, there was a Jewish library in Berlin. It wasn't exactly a Beit Midrash. And young Gershom Shalom, here's Gershom Shalom, we're going to talk about him later. Young Gershom Shalom was the librarian. And he sees Agnon, who by then was already well known. And the Jewish youth, Shalom was younger than Agnon. Shalom was about 10 or 11 years younger than Agnon. And they knew that this was the famous Agnon who had come from Eretz Yisrael. And he sees Agnon going through the card catalog in the library. And he says to him, are you looking for something? And he says, yes. What are you looking for? A book. What book? One I haven't read yet. But Agnon, he absorbed, he was not just a bibliophile, he was committed to Talmud Torah, to Torah study in a regular way throughout his life. His daughter, in that same memoir that I mentioned, he would rise very early. By habit, he would rise very early, long before dawn, before it was time to daven, and he would learn a chapter of the Rambam and a page of Gemara upstairs, right above us, every morning. And this was both Talmud Torah, but it was also a way for somebody interested in the kind of writing he was doing to fill the stock, right? To sharpen, as if he's sharpening the pen on the Torah that he's studying, because then it all gets distilled back into the writing. So he says, I'm learning Torah, and I store it up in my belly so that it should come up to my lips when I need it. If the temple were still standing, I would be up there on the platform among my singing brothers, reciting each day the song of the Levites. Right? Agnon was a Levi. He always liked to remind us that he was a Levi, and that if the Beit HaMikdash, if the temple were still around, he'd be up there singing. Agnon did not have a particularly good singing voice. He was aware of this. But since the temple remains destroyed and we have no priesthood service or Levites at song, instead I study Torah, the prophets, the writings, Mishnah, laws, and legends, supplementary treatises, and fine points of Torah and the works of the scribes. When I look at their words and see that all of the delights we possessed in ancient times, there remains only this memory, my heart fills with grief, with tsar. Now, of course, he's writing this in 1937, 30 years before the Prize Nobel, 30 years before the Nobel Prize, but he's already forced. These are words which he will revisit in the Nobel speech. They're so famous, of course, that they're written on the 50 shekel note in very small print. Right there on the 50 shekel note are these words from the Nobel Prize, which we're going to look at in a second. So when I think of what we used to have, when I think of the glory of old, I'm filled with grief because we're in exile. Even those of us that live in Eretz Yisrael, we're exiled from the Holy Temple. So what can I do? That grief makes my heart tremble, and it is out of that trembling that I write stories. Like one exiled from his father's palace who makes himself a little hut, a sukkah ketana, and sit there telling of the glory of his father's house. Now this, of course, is a foreshadow of what he's going to talk about in the Nobel Prize. You have this on the sheets. He writes, as the result of the historic, we have it here.
שהחליף טיטוס מלך רומי את ירושלים וגלה ישראל מארצו, נולדתי אני באחת מערי הגולה, אבל בכל עת תמיד דומה הייתי עליי כמי שנולד בירושלים.
I was born because of a historic catastrophe in which Titus of Rome destroyed Jerusalem and Israel was in exile from its land. I was born in one of the cities of the exile, but always I regarded myself as one who was born in Jerusalem. In a dream, in a vision of the night, I saw myself standing with my brother Levites in the Holy Temple, singing with them the songs of David Melech Yisrael, melodies such as no ear has heard since the day our city was destroyed and its people went into exile. After 30 years, the paragraph got much more poetic. I suspect that the angels in charge of the shrine of music, fearful lest I sing in wakefulness what I had sung in dream, made me forget by day what I had sung at night. For if my brethren, the sons of my people, were to hear the songs that I have to sing, the songs of the Beit HaMikdash, they would be unable to bear their grief over the happiness they have lost. To console me for having prevented me from singing with my mouth, they, the angels, enable me to compose songs in writing, so that the story writing for Agnon becomes a substitute form of divine service and a reparation for the loss of the glory of old, and a balm, a kind of medicine, a relief for the tsar, the same word here as there, the grief that we feel for that. But it's not just that. So here it's on a national plane. We used to live in glory. The Jewish people used to live in glory, and we've been exiled. And how do I deal with that grief? I write stories. But then he says, and this, who was here last week? Right? So this should echo with everything we spoke about last week. I was 5 years old when I wrote my first song. He wrote a poem. Right? When he was younger, he wrote poetry. As he got older, he stopped writing poetry. It was out of longing for my father that I wrote it. It happened that my father of blessed memory went away on business to that fair in Leshkovitz. You remember, we read about it in Hamid Pachat, in the story of the kerchief. I was overcome with longing for him, and I made a song. After that, I made many songs, but nothing has remained of them. So the story that we read yesterday becomes a story about this story, or this story becomes a story about that story, rather, which is a description of what does it mean to be a modern Hebrew author. To be a modern Hebrew author. Here's a picture of him receiving the prize from the king of Sweden. The writing becomes a sukkah, a little hut. You're exiled from the palace, you go into the little hut, and from there you reminisce about what it was like to live in the palace. Chapter 4. All that happened to the author because of a certain grammarian and all the suffering and woe that came upon the author. Agnon had only so much patience for grammarians, no offense. Since I mentioned a sukkah, since I mentioned a sukkah, let me say something about a sukkah. It once happened that I had written a story about a sukkah, a festival hut. This was in 1934, 3 years before he writes this story. Agnon's great novel, Sipur Pashut, translated as a simple story, which is no simple story. In there's a chapter, what we now have is chapter 17. That novel was originally serialized in Haaretz. And when chapter 17 made it to the newspapers, it's a scene where Herschel and Minna go to her parents for Sukkot. Have you read the Sipur Pashut, the simple story? We have a wonderful translation of it. If you can't read it in Hebrew, if you can read it in Hebrew, one way or another, you should read it. So there's a scene where the young couple goes to the in-laws for Sukkot, and they're in a sukkah. I wrote Hasukkah Mericha. The sukkah smelled nice. He used the word lehariach, the verb to smell, in an intransitive way, right? To give off a scent. A certain grammarian rose up against me, stuck his pen into me, and wrote, "You cannot say the sukkah smells. Only a person smells the aroma of the sukkah." Now this grammarian was Avraham Avrunin. Here he is. There he is. There's a criminal right there. Avrunin was a grammarian and an author. What else do we know about Avrunin? He also wrote children's songs. What's a Hanukkah song? One of those Hanukkah ditties he wrote. There he is. Looks like a perfectly reasonable fellow, but he stuck his pen right into Agnon's back, and he said, "You can't do that. You can't use the verb in that way because in those days there was something called the Vad L'Lashon HaIvrit, which today, ironically, of course, is called the Academia L'Lashon Ivrit, and people that don't like it always point out that the first word in its name is not a Hebrew word, the Academy. So on their website, they have a whole apologetica for why Academia is okay to call themselves Academia, even though they are in charge of the Hebrew language. And by the ruling of the Knesset, they are the highest authority in determining all types of things regarding the Hebrew language. Now, in those days, the Vad was originally established by Eliezer ben Yehuda. The Vad was originally established by Eliezer ben Yehuda, and there was a committee of people, and Agnon himself was involved with it, but he had an ambivalent relationship towards it. Yemei Chanukah, that's right. Yemei Chanukah, according to Google. Okay, thank you, Aaron. I never tell people when I found something on Google. I let them think I knew it before. So since I did, only a person smells the aroma of the sukkah. I was worried that perhaps I had strayed from proper usage and done harm to the beauty of the language, which would be a really bad thing because I had already explained to you why it's important to treat Hebrew very seriously. So I went and I looked in reference books, but I found no support for my usage. Most of the books either tell you what you already know or else tell you nothing at all. I went to the scholars of our time, and they did not know what to answer me. Scholars know everything except that particular thing you're looking for. Then I happened upon a certain Jerusalem scholar, so he meets somebody that gives him like a reference, but Agnon's not crazy about that reference for reasons I'll skip. I still wanted further support. When I ran into people who were experts in the Holy Tongue, I would ask them, perhaps you've heard whether it's permissible to write, Hasukkah Mericha, the sukkah smells. Some permitted, while others forbade. Neither gave any reason for their opinions, but just stated them, like a person who sticks his thumb out at someone and says, well, that's my view. Or someone who licks his lips and says, that's my feeling. That being the case, I went to erase those two words against which the grammarian had raised a protest. But when I started to do so, the sukkah came and its aroma rose before me until I really saw it was smelling. I left the words as they were. You're reminded of Galileo. You know, Galileo is forced by the Inquisition. In the 17th century, Galileo was forced to recant. He said that the earth moves around the sun. The church said, no, the sun moves around the earth is stationary. He's forced to recant. I mean, at the threat of his life, he's forced to recant. And I mean, according to legend, like the art scroll biography of Galileo, as he's leaving the room, he stomps his foot on the moving earth and says, "Eper simu evo," but yet still it moves, right? So he says, you can tell me the sukkah doesn't smell, but I smell it, and it smells beautiful. Since Hebrew, Agnon said, is not heskemi, since it's not just a matter of convention, but has inherent holiness to it. So it's not enough that this expert said that because he thought that's what it is, or this is my opinion, or this is what I think. That's meaningless. What do you need? A source. Because the source for the holiness of Hebrew is the Torah itself. So you need a source. So he has to find a source. And what happens? You know, there are other examples in this volume of other arguments Agnon had with grammarians, and they're like letters to the editor. I mean, it's interesting that they put them in here, where like he wrote something, and somebody said, I don't think you could say that. And then there's letters that go on for 3 pages that are nothing but a list of Mari Mekomot, list of reference sources where such a usage is used. In the Tanakh, in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, in the Yerushalmi, in the Midrash, in the Agadah, in the Zohar, because he knew it all. Before we had a CD-ROM where, I mean, any idiot can just punch it in and now tell you every usage of it. But he had it. He had it. So there are examples of arguments where he'll pull out all the stops and give you the list of all the references. So he says, I need a source. Chapter 5, the righteous from paradise come to the author's aid. Once somebody came to me to ask me a favor. In the course of the conversation, he told me that he was a descendant of Rabbi Yaakov Melisa. Rabbi Yaakov Melisa was a great-grandson of the Chacham Tzvi. He lived from 1760 to 1832. I put aside all my other concerns and did him great honor. I took the trouble to offer him some honey cake and a glass of whiskey. Agnon liked a little glass of whiskey. I fulfilled his request gladly out of respect for his learned ancestor whose Torah was... Oh, yes? Yetze. No, Yain Saruf is whiskey. Yain Saruf is Yash. Sometimes it's abbreviated as Yud Yud Shin. Yain Saruf is whiskey. And then Agnon goes on to describe the Sidur of Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa. That's a Sidur called Derech Chaim, which was one of these big companions to the Siddur, including a lot of reference works and like halachot and guides to observance, and a lot of, like one of those big fat Sidurim, you know, that has all the other interesting stuff stuck into it. Finally, we parted from one another, he with his prayer book and I with my thoughts. I went home to lay down on my bed to sleep a sweet sleep, since I had done a Jew a favor and gone to bed. After telling tales of the righteous, my sleep was a good one. I heard someone trying to awaken me. This is happening right here. It's upstairs, in this house. I was feeling lazy and I didn't get up. On the second try, I woke, and I saw an old man standing before me. The prayer book, Derech HaChaim, lay open in his hand. You wouldn't be able to do this at the, like if we were having a lecture series at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or even the Israel Museum, they would never let me do this. But here it is, the Sidur Derech HaChaim. Now, I know this is not the Sidur Derech Chaim in the story. I'll tell you why afterwards. But this is another copy. If you go in the library, you were all upstairs in the library. Agnon had a phenomenal library of thousands of volumes. What's most remarkable is that the library that we have upstairs is his third library. The first two being destroyed, one in fire and the other in ravished during the Arab riots. And Extra was able to rebuild it each time. This is, no one else can take, nope, no one else is allowed to touch the books. Right, let me make that clear. Here's a 1901 copy of the Derech HaChaim Siddur of Rabbi Yaakov Elisa. In the dream, he sees somebody and he's holding the Siddur Derech HaChaim. His eyes shone and his face bore a special radiance. Even though I had never seen a picture of Rabbi Yaakov Elisa, I recognized him right off. It wasn't that he looked like any of the members of his family. The great among Israel don't just look like their relatives because their Torah gives their faces a special glow. When a person darkens his face, mashchir panav, the same thing, that Agnon is busy doing, filling his belly with Torah, over the study of Torah, the Blessed One gives him a radiant glow and makes his face shine. While I was still staring, the prayer book closed, the old man disappeared, and I realized that it had been a dream. But even though I knew that, I said, there must be something to this. I washed my hands, got out of bed, and walked over to the bookcase. So upstairs in the library, Agnon has a phenomenal collection of Siddurim. He liked to compare different versions of the Tefillah and see what different Edot, how they davened. He has even for a very large library, he has an unusually large number of different Siddurim. The library is now in the process of undergoing a cataloging project so that online we'll be able to search what books Agnon had at his disposal. I noticed in it a slip of paper. If you go upstairs to the library, you'll see that the books all have these little slips of paper in them. If you look on the old, unfortunately, when they're redoing the currency in Israel again, and Agnon was rescued. Like they were going to take him off and put someone else on, but in the end, he's the only one that's staying, and everybody else is being replaced. Although it's nice that he was rescued because the decision was to put only authors and poets on the Israeli currency in this next round of the currency. So there's going to be a third round of currency with Agnon on it. There's the one that we have in our pocket. There's the previous version that was published in the 80s. This is the 50 shekel note in its previous version. You see here when they drew in the current 50. Anybody have a 50 shekel on their wallet? Pull it out. You see the library. You see all the books. But here in this illustration of the books, you see they have all these little ptakim, all these little kliplach, all these little pieces of little bookmarks sticking out of the books, and that's exactly what it looks like. That's exactly what it looks like upstairs. So he says, Rabbi Yaakov Elisa comes to me in a dream, and I wake up, I go and I pull out a siddur, and there's a bookmark. And you know what? I went upstairs and I found the Siddur Derech HaChaim, and what was there? A bookmark with Agnon's handwriting on it. Because this is the amazing thing. And if you ever have an opportunity at the National Library, when this house was turned into a museum, almost all of his manuscripts were given over to the National Library, to the archives. And they have an archive of Agnon, and scholars go there and they compare manuscripts. I mentioned in the past, of course, Agnon was an inveterate reviser and polisher of his works, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 drafts of stories. But in those days, paper was really expensive, so the publishers would send back the galleys. I don't know if you can see it here. Here's the galley of a story which he would then do corrections on and then either send them back or not send them back. And then, but when he was done, he'd use the back side, the blank side of the page, so Agnon wrote in longhand. And his poor wife, you were discussing it on the tour, his poor wife had to type it all up. He had a very difficult handwriting, and there were only very few people that could decipher it. And they would do, so if you go to the National Archives to do that kind of research, on the backs of these, sometimes it's more interesting what you find on the back than on what it is that you're. It's like, you know, in the Geniza work, sometimes they would find manuscripts in the bindings of Sfarim. Paper would be thrown out; it would be used to rebind a book. And sometimes what's hidden in the bindings from the Middle Ages is as interesting as the book itself. So here's a little, and then at a certain point it gets cut up as a bookmark. So on one side there's typescript. I mean, there's only two words. It says Yesh Noach Brachot. I don't know what that is. On the other side, there's this handwriting which is hard to read. I can make out that it says Yom Kippur among three other lines. But then it gets cut up and uses a bookmark. And he says, I go to the shelf and I open up and there's a bookmark there on the page. And you know what it says on that page? It's a page that's talking about Shavuot. And it says that on Shavuot, there's a custom. Nohagim lahamid anfei ilanot lefi umarbim b'minei prachim hamerechim. On Shavuot in shul, they would put flowers. What kind of flowers? Smelly flowers, nice smelly flowers. So he says, you see, Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa came to me in a dream to tell me you were right. You can use the word that way. How do I know that you can use that word that way? Because I used it that way. And I was Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa. And not just Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa, he also noticed Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa had an uncle, the Yavet. The Yavet is Yaakov ben Tzvi, Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, 17th century, 18th century. Rabbi Yaakov Emden died in 1776. It's an easy date for us Yankees to remember. In his Siddur, the Amudei Shamayim, the pillars of heaven, which is right here, this is probably the actual Siddur that Agnon used when in this story, because it's the only copy of this Siddur he has in the library. Here's this Siddur, 1863, published in Lemberg, which is, you know, the capital of Galicia, what they call today Lvov. And in this Siddur is the same lashon, prachim hamerechim, right? Flowers that give off smell. Now I know that this is not the original Derech Chaim. He had more than one copy, because in that same, I mentioned it now 3 times. You should read it. Emuna Yaron, Agnon's daughter, has a memoir about her life as Agnon's literary executive, about her life as Agnon's daughter, and she mentions that the family was always very into birthdays. And for birthdays, they'd always have a party. They'd have a shulchan matanot. Everybody got a present. And one year, her husband, Chaim Yaron, who passed away last year, just last year, a little bit more than a year ago, he was also very involved with her in publishing the works. Agnon gave him as a present a very old copy of the Siddur Derech Chaim. They, of course, knew the story Chush HaRei'ach. They get home from the party, he opens it up, and he finds a little scrap of paper. And under those words, Prachim Merichim, he sees Agnon had drawn a line. So that copy of the Derech Chaim, probably the one that Agnon pulls off the shelf in the story, is now at Emuna Yaron's house, I imagine. I was glad that I hadn't failed in my words and had done no harm to our holy tongue. If these two great pillars of the universe wrote this way, it must indeed be proper. The grammarian who had shot off his mouth at me would one day have to pay his due. So in other words, Agnon writes a story. He uses a word. He gets in trouble for it. He's distraught that maybe he used the word the wrong way. The ghost, the apparition of Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa comes to him to save the day. He goes to Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa, he opens it up. There's his own bookmark. It reminds Emerson has a line where he says that in every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. In other words, the act of remembering what you once knew, the recollected memory itself comes back and saves him. So now it's the middle of the night. It's too late to, it was hardly worth going back to bed since most of the night had passed, but it wasn't yet time for the morning prayers. So what's he going to do? Like, he's been visited by the ghost of, right, the ghost of Shavuot past, pardon the expression, and he finds that he's right, and then Avrunin is wrong. But it's too early to go to daven, and it's too late to go back to bed. So what does a Jew do? You say Tehillim. You say Tehillim. I got up and took the book of Psalms. Reciting Psalms is good any time, but especially early in the morning when the soul is still pure and the lips are not yet defiled by wicked chatter. I sat and I read a few Psalms. Some I understood on my own, and the rest were explained to me by Rashi of blessed memory, until I completed the first book of the Sefer Tehillim. My soul wanted to say more. I did its bidding, and I read Psalm after Psalm until I got to the Psalm of the chief musician upon lilies. That's Perek Mem Hey, chapter 45 in Sefer Tehillim. This is a song in praise of the sages' disciples. It's a Tehillim about Talmidei Chachamim. The Gemara and Shabbat learns it as a description of how Talmidei Chachamim get along or don't get along. There's some militaristic language in that chapter, and it's used to describe the kind of the battle that's fought between scholars. So therefore, it's kind of appropriate to the theme of the story. That was a beautiful hour of psalm saying. The lamp on the table was lit, crowning with light every word, every letter, every vowel point, every musical notation. Opposite it, there was a window open facing the south. Right there. You see this door? See this door? Right above this door is Agnon's stender. Here. Here's the house. Here's the house. There's Emunah Yaron. We were talking about her earlier. There's her brother Chemdat. There's Esther. And here's the study upstairs. I said last time, Agnon generally liked to write standing up at this stender. Here it is. And here's the window. That window is right above this door, facing south. Right? He's standing at the stender, at the stand, saying Tehillim, looking out the window. A sound was heard from the treetops, the voice of a bird reciting her song. Such a voice could interrupt a person's studies, but I didn't get up from my book to listen to the bird's voice, even though it was both sweet to the ear and attractive to the heart. In other words, I didn't even know a bird was singing. Somebody who says they didn't know a bird was singing, and not only does he know that it was singing, but it was sweet. I said, here I am reciting the Psalms. Should I interrupt these to listen to the talk of birds? Soon another voice was to be heard, even more attractive than the first. One bird had gotten jealous of the other and decided to outdo him in song. Did he listen to the birds? Oh boy, did he listen to these birds. Or maybe she wasn't jealous and hadn't even noticed. He could tell you every note, right? She was aroused on her own to sing before her Creator, and her voice was just sweeter than the other bird. In the end, they made peace with one another, and each bird seemed to complement the other one's melodies. They're singing in harmony. Right? There's a machlokas, there's a disagreement, and in the end, there's harmony. There are different ways that machloket can be resolved. There are different ways that disagreement can be resolved. Sometimes because the two voices decide to sing in harmony, and sometimes because you can put down the other voice. They sang new songs, the likes of which no ear had heard. Melodies and voices like these certainly couldn't keep a man from studying, but I made as though I didn't hear. There's nothing especially wondrous or praiseworthy about this, because the psalm played itself like an instrument of many strings. So he says, it's not that I'm such a righteous person that I'm able to concentrate on my reciting of Tehillim. The Tehillim itself is wondrous. It's a musical creation that outdistances even nature. And we have this idea of Tehillim, right? The 150 chapters of Tehillim as being the apex of Hebrew literary creation, right? Which can even defeat nature itself. Which can even beat nature itself. A song of love next to which all those songs there is nothing. I followed after its every word with melody. My heart overfloweth with good manner, my tongue the pen of ready scribe. So here he's quoting from the Tehillim itself. Hold on a second, where are we? Here we are. Here's the capital. You have it on the page. It's worth. We don't have time to read through the whole chapter, but it's worth reading the whole chapter because the whole chapter itself is a reflection of the story, and it's a story about all of these themes, the conflict between different points of view, nature. So in verse 9, more of these are types of bisamim. These are types of plants that give off a nice smell. Kol bigdotecha min hechalei shen min simchuch. Right? Myrrh and aloe and cassia, whatever these things are all your garments. More than ivory palaces, those that are mine will cause you to rejoice. And then he says, I don't know what these words mean, because these are funny words. So he says, what do you do? What does a Jew do when you come across a word you don't understand? You look at Rashi. And that's what Rashi is for. So Rashi says, Kol bigdotecha, all of your garments, beged, your garments, Kol bigadecha merichim, give off a smell, kereach bisamim, kereach bisamim. Right? In other words, you put perfume on, and your clothing is going to give off a smell. So you see, Rashi. So he says, Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa Mela, but Rashi. You don't get better than Rashi. And there's another explanation. Midrasho, kol bigdotecha v'sichronecha mitkaprim u'merichim reach arev. Beged means clothing. Begida means betrayal or trespass. Right? So that your trespasses, your averot, your sins themselves, when you fix yourself, your sins themselves, when you do tshuva, will give off a nice, pleasant smell. So he says, my mind was eased like a person smelling flowers that smell. The conclusion, the little last final epitaph. Come and see how great this holy tongue, how great is this holy tongue. For the sake of a single word, a holy man troubled himself to come out of the academy on high in Gan Eden, bringing his book before me, causing me to rise up at night to recite the Psalms so that I might find something I'd been seeking for days. So that, who's the real enemy here? What, I mean, Avrunin, poor Avrunin, there's a very interesting book, which is hard to come by. It's out of print, called Beit Agnon v'Tchiat HaSafa HaIvrit. Even though I said earlier he didn't think that Beit Agnon and the revival of the Hebrew language. It's only available in Hebrew. It's by somebody named Bar Adon. Bar Adon was the author. And in there, there's a lengthy chapter that describes this whole episode, the whole episode of this fight over this one word. Only grammarians could fight over one word. Here we are. So Avrunin, his fault, Agnon is telling us, is the idea that a word can only mean one thing. And Agnon made a career of writing where every word always meant more than one thing, where there were always multiple layers of meaning compacted into each word. We had an opportunity a few days ago that some of us here in the Beit Agnon, we were reading Agnon's very well-known story, Maseh Ha'ez, the fable of the goats, which anybody who's read any Agnon has read. That little 4 pages long. When Agnon started writing that story, it was twice as long. When he wrote it the first time, it was twice as long. And the process of revising it gets boiled down till it's so dense that you can't fit in another comma or semicolon, because it's so impacted with meaning that every word has multiple layers of meaning and sending you off in multiple directions, multiple echoes and hints. There's a debate that took place about the nature of Hebrew it wasn't a debate. There were different points of view. I'll just to demonstrate it, I'll present two of them. In 1926, when Franz Rosenzweig was dying, here's Franz Rosenzweig. Franz Rosenzweig, he was like one of the most creative Jewish minds in Europe in the 20th century. He died tragically young. He had, what later became known as Lou Gehrig's disease, and he communicated in the last years of his life both with like one of these Ouija board things, because he couldn't speak anymore, and he wrote books, with one of these, Ouija board types of things, and his wife would write down, and then later, when he couldn't even do that, he and his wife had this system where he would blink, like A, he would blink once, and B, he would blink twice, and C, he would blink 3 times, and she deciphered this, and she'd write it down, and he died, like mid-blink. So his last unfinished sentence is left unfinished. He's one of the most creative, interesting Jewish thinkers in the 20th century. So when he was dying, his friends decided to put together a book, like a collection of letters and writings for him. And they did this, and it was undiscovered until I think the 1980s, this collection. And who Agnon wrote in there? Agnon wrote a story, of course. It was the prototype of what later became his story, B'Levav Yamim, in the heart of the seas, his great tale of Chibat Zion. Shalom, Gershom Shalom, who was younger than all of these other folks. Gershom Shalom ultimately came to Israel and invented the academic study of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, and became a giant in his own right. He and Agnon had a long, sometimes difficult friendship, but a long friendship. We could talk about that another time. And Shalom writes, you have the whole letter here. We don't have time to read the whole thing. Shalom writes a letter to Rosenzweig. He writes it from Israel. He'd already come to Israel. It's written in December 1926 from Yerushalayim. He'd already come in Aliyah. The letter itself was written in German and sent to this thing, and it was undiscovered into the 80s. And Shalom writes to Rosenzweig. Apparently, it was the continuation of a debate that they'd had when they were both in Germany. And Shalom says, he warns, more sinister than the Arab problem here in Palestine is another threat, a threat which the Zionist enterprise unavoidably has had to face, the actualization of Hebrew, meaning the attempt to use Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, for everyday use, to go to the car mechanic, to go to the barbershop, to go, and in a kind of apocalyptic warning, Shalom says, it's impossible to empty out words which are filled to the breaking point with specific meanings, lest it be done at the sacrifice of the language itself. Would not the religious power of this language perforce break open again one day? Fraught with danger is the Hebrew language. God will not remain silent in the language in which he has affirmed our life 1,000 times and more. Language, the Hebrew language is, in Shalom's words, a volcano. And since it's a language which is so densely impacted with religious meaning, even in Shalom's point of view, fanatic religious meaning. Shalom was not religious. If we're going to try to revive it and think that those epochs of meaning are going to be neutralized, it's going to come back to bite us. It's a volcano which will explode. Fanaticism all over the culture and society that's trying to use this tool, right? There's no way that it's not going to come back to get us. As he aged, Shalom moderated his view on this. This is the kind of thing a young man writes. And it could be that he just like looked around. He got older and he looked around and he saw that, you know, like you've been to the supermarket, you know, like La Isha. I mean, for those of you online, you may not know what La Isha. You know what La Isha is? It's like Israeli. What's the American equivalent? Cosmopolitan, right? Like a ladies' magazine with all types of trashy Hirschkeit and maybe there's horoscopes in there. I've never read it. I profess. Well, one can imagine. You know, it's listening to the birds is like saying Tehillim, right? So you see that, you know, it could be that Ivrit also functions on this very unholy plane. That maybe that's the Rambam's warning that you can do damage to it. But he moderated his point. On the other hand, they weren't in dialogue about this. Bialik had a different point of view. Bialik thought that we could revive Hebrew. Not only can we revive Hebrew, but we can do it with the building blocks of the holy canon itself, and yet neutralize the meaning. We can reprogram it. Now, the most famous now, whenever we're talking about Bialik in this topic in 3 minutes, we're doing a disservice. Because Bialik's relationship to Hebrew and to Jewish culture was very complex, and by definition, I'm going to be oversimplifying here. But everybody knows Bialik's famous Nad Nida. This is a tzilum we just bought for our son. There's a reprint of the 1933 Bialik's collection of poems and songs for children with these original, you know, illustrations. You know, I remember being a kid in Hebrew school in the early 70s, and that's what the illustrations and all the books looked like. And then somehow we evolved after beyond these kinds of illustrations. But you know, everybody knows his song Nad Nida. You go to any playground today, you find it. Raid ale ale raid. Up and down, right? The seesaw song, right? Male, 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 mata. What's above, what's below? Rakani, ani, vata. Just me and you. Shneinu shkulim b'maznayim. We two held in equilibrium. Bein haaretz lashamayim. Between heaven and earth. Now, every kid knows this. You know, in the Ganim, they have like these curricula. Our youngest son is in Gan. We have a 3.5-year-old is in Gan. And I get to Gan a couple of weeks ago, and there's a big poster of Chaim Nachman Bialik, a very precocious young man at home. And he comes at 3.5, and he's who midaklaim Chaim Nachman Bialik, and he'll sing Bialik, which is wonderful. I love it. That's what we came to Israel for. It's part of what we came to Israel for. But I said to the guy, "Oh, you're studying Bialik." So she sends it because she thinks that she doesn't know like I'm this Meshuggah who reads Agnon all day long, and so she thinks like I'm nervous because Bialik he wasn't. So she said, so the Ganenet says, "Anachnu melamdim rak et hapan hadati." We only teach the religious part of Bialik. And I'm like, which part would that be? So which part was it? That he was a yeshiva bacher. All right. So, okay. So what's this song? Everybody knows this song, even though sometimes they sing it a little different. It's a Mishnah. There's a Mishnah in Chagiga. The Mishnah in Chagiga says, "Kol ha-mistakel ba'arba dvarim ra'ui lo ki'ilu lo bala olam." Whoever thinks about these 4 things, it's better if he'd never come into the world. What are these theological questions that it's better one should not speculate about? Mala mala, mala mata. What's above? What's below? Malifnim, malachor. What the exact content of these 4 questions is debated amongst the Meforshim, but it obviously has something to do with the very existence of God. Mala 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 mata. So Bialik says, well, we can reprogram this, and we can stick it into a nursery rhyme. into a playground ditty. So that not only is God dead, he's buried in the sandbox by the little school children that are singing Mala 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 Mata Rakani Ani. It's just me and you. There's nothing else here. We are held between heaven and earth. There's nothing else here. So Bialik had this idea that we could neutralize the values while still maintaining, while still holding on to the framework of it. He has this famous line where he said, there are a number of very important essays where Bialik talks about Jewish culture and the Hebrew language and its role, and some of it is really quite inspiring, But he says that, we can be mechalel. What does it mean to be mechalel? Like kodesh and chol, holy and secular. We can secularize these sources. We can secularize a discussion about even the existence of God. What does he mean by chalel? What does it mean by chalel? He means, like we say in the pasuk in Sefer Shoftim, about who doesn't have to go to war. Right? The Torah says that if somebody, right, mi ha'isha shenata kerem v'lo chilalo. Who's the person, if you planted a vineyard and you didn't yet chilalo, you didn't yet get to take advantage of, you didn't get to enjoy the pleasures of it. What does it mean? Because, in other words, when you plant a vineyard in halacha, the first 3 years it's holy. And then you can use it for secular purposes. So it's a type of redemption. He says we can redeem our sources, emptying it of holy connotation, and use it for playground dog rule. Agnon was neither like his friend Shalom nor like his friend Bialik, although it's important to note that he was friends with both of them and was able to maintain friendships with all of these people and people that disagreed with them in even greater ways. That says something about him. But Agnon was neither like this nor like that, because he saw Hebrew, and he saw his role as a Hebrew writer. He saw that craft, Hebrew was not something to be afraid of, to be feared, like Shalom, nor was it something that could be neutralized or emptied of its content, like Bialik. For Agnon, it's a sukkah. It's a receptacle by which we can hold values in the meantime while we're exiled from the palace, and distilling it into the storytelling becomes a kind of sukkah where we can recall the delights of the past. And only prize, authors would come from all over the world, and it was like Aliyah L'Regel. They would come to visit Agnon, and certainly after he got the Nobel Prize. So Saul Bellow, in 1967, comes to visit Agnon. They're sitting upstairs, and Saul Bellow, the great American Jewish writer, and what? From Chicago. Okay. He himself got the Nobel a couple of years later. And they're talking, and Agnon had not read any of Saul Bellow because he didn't read English. Agnon read Hebrew, and Bellow wasn't sure about this, and he says to He says to Agnon, well, you know, what about Heinrich Heine? He's done pretty well in German. He's had a good run of it. Ah, replied Agnon, we have him beautifully translated into Hebrew. He is safe. Now, I'm sensitive to the fact that we've had this conversation for the past hour and 15 minutes in English. And I'm sensitive to the fact that many of us, both you here in the audience in Agnon's own home and you online, are able to read Agnon only in English. And I posted, I hope you had a chance to look at it. If not, go home and read it. Hillel Halkin wrote this. Do you read it? Do you have a chance to read it? Halkin wrote this. It's like a kina. It's like an elegy for Hebrew, and he's guilty about it because he's our greatest translator of Hebrew literature into English, right? And he feels guilty about that. He says, until modern times, a Jew with a reading knowledge of Hebrew, and only such a Jew. He says earlier, he says that Hebrew, throughout the diaspora, throughout all the long years of our exile, Hebrew was not the first language of any Jew, but it was the second language of every Jew. And then he says, until modern times, a Jew with a reading knowledge of Hebrew, and only such a Jew, had access to the thought and creativity of Jews everywhere. Today, living in translation has its advantages for the Jewish people. It facilitates communication among them, disseminates Jewish culture, creates a new Jewish literacy to replace the old one that has been lost, yet it dilutes the culture it disseminates, weakens Jewish distinctiveness, puts Jews at remove from themselves. And that's a warning message. That's a warning message to us all. Agnon's point here about Hebrew as a vehicle for memory will be sharpened for us next week. Next week, we're going to study his story, Hasiman, the sign, which has many parallels to the story we just read. It's a little bit longer, but it's about Hebrew writing as a vessel for memory after the Holocaust. This story we read today was written in 1937 about events that took place in 1934. After the Holocaust, the role of the modern Hebrew writer changes dramatically, and that's what we'll talk about next time when we read The Sign. For our final session in 2 weeks' time, we're going to read the story that's translated here as Pisces, which is, I've warned you all these weeks now, is quite a bit longer than all the stories you read until now, so I'm giving you all a heads up to read it in advance. Pisces in English, it's called Pisces. Again, if just two things. If we don't have your email, make sure you have your email. For those of you that are interested, I'd like to add a PS. Those of you that have to go, I understand. I want to add a PS, an interesting thought about the uses of language. If those of you that have the patience to sit with us. Here I was going to discuss aeroplane, but that's a different topic. Why there was a debate between Ben Yehuda and Bialik about the word for airplane. Bialik thought the word should be, Ben Yehuda thought the word should be aviron, which only my mother-in-law still uses. If she's, I don't know if she's online with us. Is she online with us? There she is. Hello, Mom. And matos. Bialik chose the word matos, but Bialik chose a word that itself had biblical roots or echoes, and Ben Yehuda chose a word which has a cognate in the Gemara, avira, but that word in and of itself is a Greek word borrowed into Aramaic. So avir, like air, right? So Ben Yehuda, but Bialik thought you needed to look first at Tanakh. You needed to first have Tanakh type words. There's interesting research going on now about language. You know, Chomsky, that other great lover of Zion, Noam Chomsky had an idea that all language is essentially the same. Now, apparently, that idea is no longer in fashion, which is too bad because it is the basis of Star Trek. how to start. They land on a planet, seek out new life and new civilizations. They get there. How do they all speak the same language? So they have this device, the intergalactic translator, which is based upon Chomskyan theory that all language anywhere in the universe, not just on the planet Earth, will have a certain common underlying structure. And the computer should be able, because it's all Heskemi, right? We call this a book, and somebody else calls it a Sefer, and somebody else calls it a Libra, right? But a computer should be able to figure that all out and figure out the differences in syntax between different languages and simultaneously translate. I mean, Google does it now, virtually. You know, Google Translate, you can type in anything and it simultaneously translates it for you, and it doesn't do a bad job. It really doesn't do a bad job. I mean, it's not, you wouldn't pub this data, but you can make yourself understood. You can understand what you can cut and paste from any other language and put it into Google Translator and basically understand more or less what it's talking about. You wouldn't publish it as fine literature in translation that way, but apparently Chomsky is wrong. And there's all this interesting research. One of it being done, there's a book called Through the Language Glass that came out, which was done by an Israeli working in America. But there's this professor in Stanford who did this really interesting experiment. You know, there's certain languages, like Hebrew. English doesn't have this, of course, but certain languages have masculine and feminine genders. These are just random assignments of words. They did this experiment. They went to German speakers, word association, and they'd give them a word, and they'd ask them, you know, just adjectives. What comes to mind? They give them a word like bridge. And what word did the Germans come up with? These were the most common associations. Fragile, elegant, beautiful, peaceful, slender, pretty. In German, bridge is a feminine noun. But then they asked about key, der Schlüssel. And how is it described? Hard, heavy, jagged, metal, serrated, useful. In German, of course, der Schlüssel is a masculine noun. In Spanish, for no apparent reason whatsoever, they're reversed. The Spanish speakers associated with bridge words like a masculine noun, strong, dangerous, long, sturdy, big, towering, and key, which in Spanish is feminine, golden, intricate, little, lovely, shiny, tiny. Now, the idea that the language you speak, the language with which you are at home, influences in subtle ways your associations, how you think about the world, your values. All this research seems to be pointing in that direction. And if it's true that the language we speak, the literature we consume, have these kinds of side effects on our worldview, so it's even more important, as Agnon said, to remember, for this reason, all Israel should take care with their language, keeping it clear and precise, treating Hebrew with respect and dignity and kavod, and just to be involved in it, that we should read Hebrew, that we should be involved in Hebrew life and culture, because it's bound to have an impact on who we are and how we see the world. So I thank you all here online for coming out on a rainy night, and for those online, if we don't have your email, make sure that Nikki gets your email, and we'll continue next week. If anybody has any questions, I'll stay online, either from the audience or